joining us this morning for our first Power Breakfast of the year. We've been busy. I can't believe this is our first, but we've been really in the throes of it all. And really, as the city gets moving again, ABNY has worked to be at the center of the biggest emerging issues facing the post-pandemic New York. Off the heels of our last Power Breakfast in 2022, where the mayor and the governor announced their Making New York for Everyone action plan, we've been busy. We've been busy convening New Yorkers and being the place for pitching new ideas and coming up with solutions. Since January, we've held 20 convenings, tackling the topics and challenges facing the future of our great city. Our young professionals met with Chief Housing Officer Jessica Katz to discuss expanding the housing supply across the entire city, increasing access to stable homes, and helping deliver long overdue improvements to NYCHA tenants. Our ABNY Women Network hosted Camille Joseph Varlick, Chief of Staff to Mayor Adams, for her first public appearance, where she talked about her work at City Hall and the administration's efforts to support new New Yorkers. And our ABNY members have been enthralled in dialogue with many of the city and state's top officials, like the New York State Superintendent Adrian Harris, City Planning Chair Dan Grodnick, and Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado. ABNY has always been a forum for diverse voices to move our city forward. And right now, we are at a critical time in our city and our state for many of the issues that we care about most. And we need to take action for a better New York for all New Yorkers. We're facing many challenges for the future of our city, making sure we have reliable, safe, and accessible public transit system. And we have Jana Lieber in our audience today. Finding ways to reimagine New York's business districts as a vibrant 24/7 destination. And we have many of the folks from our business improvement districts and our chambers here in the audience today as well. And making sure New York City continues to be a hub for future industries and innovations, while we make sure growth is fair and equitable for our small businesses and for our workforce. However, the biggest challenge to our city is affordability, and more specifically, housing is at the core of it. So in the coming months, we welcome all of you in this room to join us as we focus on these issues. And the most important way ABNY has been able to do this work is through the ABNY Foundation. Over the years, we've invested millions of dollars in support as the city works through many of the issues through our micro grants. Just this year, we've issued dozens of grants to support the generation of our communities and the organizations that serve them, who illustrate a focus on the city's economic recovery in the priority areas of public realm revitalization and improved livability, arts, culture, and entertainment, public safety, small business support, and workforce development. And we've been very fortunate to consistently bolster foundation funds through several sources, including major donors, philanthropic revenue, and fundraising events. So I'm here to remind you today, you knew it was coming, right? Our primary source of funding for the ABNY Foundation is our annual Spirit of ABNY Awards fundraiser. This year, in 2023, the Spirit of ABNY Awards is on May 15th at the Rainbow Room, and we will be honoring civic luminaries who have provided a distinguished level of service to our great city. Albert Bourla, Chairman and CEO of Pfizer, Adrian Adams, Speaker of the New York City Council, and our very own Francis Rancheski, ABNY Board Member and former Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Con Edison. So if you haven't purchased a ticket, please visit our website and purchase your ticket now. Please help us support the work that we do. And the work that we do supports our city. and match what this dynamic city demands to ensure its future is what we want it to be and what we need it to be. A place where we work together on solutions for all of New Yorkers and for New York's most pressing economic and social needs. And that brings me to our guest today. I can't think of one person who has the most experience in New York's most pressing and economic social needs. He has been a public servant who can articulate these challenges from a very unique place. Today, we are honored to host Congressman Ritchie Torres, someone who governs from a place of lived experiences. He's from the Bronx. I'll forgive him. It's okay. But he really, oh, come on, where's Queens? Queens is not gonna stand up? That's okay. Thank you. But we're really honored to have him with us today because he really understands the nuances of poverty and struggle. So I'd like to introduce our ABNY's Chairman, Steven Rubenstein, who's going to introduce our special guest today and be in conversation with him. Thank you.
First, let me thank Melva. I want to thank Melva. She does incredible work. She's a wonderful CEO and leader for ABNY. So Melva, we love you, we appreciate you. And I just want to say one thing about affordability before I get to introduce the Congressman. We've thought a lot what matters to New York City, keeping our community strong, keeping our business community strong. We think it's hard. If you can't live in the neighborhood you grew up in, you can't live in the next neighborhood, you can't afford to live in the next neighborhood, or the next neighborhood, like what fundamentally does that do to our city long term? And we're nervous about it. I think a lot of people feel it as they head out into their jobs, they start families. So we're gonna try to make this a big focus. There are other things we're gonna do too, and we really wanna ask you guys for your help because it's something we need to turn around in the long term. Anyway, there's one question I get a lot at ABNY, and that is, who should we look to as the future leaders of our city, our state, and our federal governments? Well, one of those answers is right here with us today, Congressman Ritchie Torres. And after spending time with him this morning, I know you'll all hear and see exactly why. At ABNY, we have great respect for people who dedicate their lives to public service and the greater good. Those who serve New York while they serve as an example, leaders who inspire us as they aspire to do the best for us. Ritchie Torres is all of those things. He grew up in the Bronx in NYCHA's Throgs Neck houses with his twin brother, older sister, and his mother. He shared something deeply resonant with the 1 out of 15 New Yorkers who calls public housing their home. Mold that gave him asthma, no heat on winter nights, elevators that broke down so often he was more frightened when the elevator did come than when it didn't. But gradually, his talents began to emerge. As Lehman High School debate team captain, he twice led them to citywide championships. And from there, he got into one of our city's great universities, NYU. At NYU, he struggled, something he has been very open about. He struggled from the fears and anxieties that plague so many of our youth today. Ultimately, he left before graduating. But from that depth began a remarkable ascent in politics. He started as a hungry 20-year-old intern in Jimmy Vaca's council office. By 25, he was a council member himself, chairing the heavyweight committees on public housing and investigations, where he did truly creative and critical work for our city. Now he's in Washington. He holds the seat Jose Serrano held for more than 30 years, representing a district spanning half of the Bronx. He's so good at his job that the Center for Effective Lawmaking just named Ritchie the most effective freshman in the 117th Congress. I guess after the City Council, apparently the House of Representatives is easy peasy for Ritchie Torres. Even though the Congressman is still only at the beginning of his political life, you can tell he's a star, and he's a star for the right reasons. He's someone we can admire. He's someone we want to be like. He's somebody we can identify with. He's honest about the all too human struggles he has faced, even as he bravely forged a path through them. Over and over, he's proven it's not a fool's errand to spend time and energy tackling our biggest problems. And he's someone who respects and embraces people who are different. We're proud to have him represent us, and I'm excited to have him with us here today. Everyone, Please join me in giving a warm ABNY welcome to Congressman Ritchie Torres.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments.
All right, let's get into it.
Early morning.
Good morning. Most effective. How is one effective in what, from the outside, seems a little unusual right now in Congress?
Effectiveness in Congress. I mean, ultimately, effectiveness is measured by what you do. So the legislation you pass, the oversight hearings you hold, the constituent services you provide. And there are multiple models of congressional representation. You know, there are members who seek to be a power broker within Congress. There are members who want to be the local mayor in their districts. There are members who want to be the masters of public relations.
Nothing wrong with that?
No, nothing wrong with that. And I would highly recommend Rubenstein. And then there are members who want to be policymakers. And I think obviously I'm going to embrace some combination of all those models, but in the end, I feel like I'm there to make policy. And that's where my focus has been.
And can you talk about, like, what does great policy look like for you now, whether it's as a resident of the Bronx, a New Yorker, or somebody who really, has a part in the direction of our nation?
Look, when you're a member of Congress, you're local, national, and international at the same time. Like, one moment you're speaking to a constituent about potholes on Fordham Road, and the next moment you're participating in a classified war game about a possible war in the Taiwan Strait between the United States and China. And so you have a wide variety of experiences. My greatest passion, as you know, is public housing. So I was born and raised in public housing. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. And we came extraordinarily close to providing NYCHA with the funding that it needed to address the humanitarian crisis in public housing. We passed the Build Back Better Act in the House, which would have set aside about $60 billion for public housing, $40 billion of which would have gone to NYCHA. But of course, it was ultimately filibustered in the Senate. So one day I might be in a public housing unit inspecting the leaking and molded conditions, and the next day I'm in Washington, D.C. fighting for more federal investment. And so the ability to connect the local and the national, I think, is a unique feature of life as a congressman.
On a state level, it was not a great week for advancing legislation to build more housing.
Yeah.
Seems as if the governor's entire housing plan has kind of fallen apart at this moment in the negotiations.
Yeah.
And we seem to have been stuck for some time, right, in terms of what we can build and the programs that are out there. Like, if you could take out a blank piece of paper and say what you think kind of top priorities are for the state and the way the federal government could recreate it to really help people, as somebody who's lived through a lot of public housing growing up, what would you do?
Look, it's straightforward. At the heart of the affordability crisis is a gap between supply and demand. Right? The demand for affordable housing far exceeds the supply. So there's a need to expand the supply of affordable housing to meet the demand. But there's also a need to expand housing subsidy to ensure that the affordable housing units we're creating are affordable to the lowest income New Yorkers. When it comes to housing supply, that's largely the domain of state and local government. Francis Fukuyama has a term known as vetocracy, government by veto. And we have land use processes that allow people to easily veto affordable housing development. Look, I was a former council member. In the council, we have a kind of tradition of municipal feudalism in which each council member treats his council district or her council district as a personal fiefdom. And we have the power to veto hundreds or thousands of units of affordable housing. And that undermines our ability to address the affordability crisis. And then there's a need for housing subsidy. The people I keep in mind are the families in the South Bronx. I often refer to the South Bronx as the essential borough of New York City, because during COVID, we saw essential workers put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that the rest of the city could safely shelter in place. And I worry that our city has become dangerously unaffordable to the very essential workforce on whom we depend for our success and survival. You know, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition did a study and found that there's not a single county in America where an essential worker earning minimum wage could afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And out of 3,000 counties, there were only 7 where such a worker could afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So, one of my proposals would be housing vouchers for all, right? Every family struggling with housing insecurity or homelessness should have access to a housing voucher, which ensures that you pay no more than 30% of your income toward your rent. I mean, that to me would be a powerful tool for radically reducing homelessness and housing insecurity, not only in the Bronx, but across the country.
And talk to me about obviously, Senate and House, or what's the path for that now? Is it watch government change, or is there?
Congress is a long game. It takes years, if not decades, to achieve systemic change. The most transformational policy of the Biden administration was the child tax credit, which cut child poverty by 50% across the country. The child tax credit was the culmination of decades and decades of advocacy on the part of one of my colleagues, Rosa DeLauro, who first introduced legislation on the child tax credit in 2002. And it did not become law until 2021. So the fundamental difference between city government, which provides you with instant gratification, and federal government.
Sometimes.
Well, it could be sadistic, masochistic, but yes, yeah. Well, I was in the legislature. I think the mayor's role is more painful, but Congress is a long game, and you have to be patient with the legislative process.
So you're not giving up on this. If this takes you 20 years, vouchers, you're.
Look, the median age in Congress is 80, so I have to. I just turned 35, and someone said you're old enough to run for president. I'm like, 45 years from now, yes. Until recently, I refer to Congress as a gerontocracy, because until recently, all of our leaders were above the age of 80. Almost all of our committee chairs were above the age of 70. And there's a wonderful story about Richie Neal, who's one of the great committee chairs in Congress. When he became the Ways and Means chair at age 69, one of his friends said, "Wow, Richie, now you have your whole career ahead of you." So I'm like an embryo in Congress.
Speaking of 80-year-olds, this morning at 6:30, the president announced that he was going to run for president, again for re-election. If elected, he'd be 82 at the time. If he served a full term, he'd be 86. 9 years older than Ronald Reagan was, which at the time we thought was really old. I guess, and also now he's going to go up against Donald Trump. It does feel like Back to the Future a little bit. I guess and I saw you've already tweeted full support for the president earlier this morning. I guess the question I have is, as you talk about this aging legislative leadership, obviously we have aging president and candidates, is it able to represent what is a really growing youth in our country who have very different seems to be one approaches, but two, also different economics. The economics seem to get harder for kids coming out of college or just out of high school trying to get jobs. And so I'd say to you is the system kind of fundamentally broken in this regard, that it doesn't really represent the breadth of who's out there?
I'll make one gentle self-criticism of Congress, of my party, and then I think one area where I think the Republicans are better than us is building a bench. And so in Congress, there are actually term limits on Republicans for committee chairs or ranking members. You can only be a committee chair or ranking member for 3 terms, and then you have to create space for a new generation of leadership. Whereas among the Democrats, there are no term limits, and so there are members who feel like they have a God-given right to die with their gavel. And that stifles, I believe, the development of the next generation of leadership. So I feel like as a party, we have to be much more effective at building a bench rather than benching on young talent. As far as President Biden, after January 6th, we saw a period of peak polarization and partisanship in DC. It was a poisonous atmosphere. And I never imagined that against that backdrop, he would build what I believe has been one of the most productive and productively bipartisan presidencies in recent memory. He passed a bipartisan gun safety bill, which would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. Passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill, some of the largest investments in public transit. He passed a bipartisan research and development bill with a particular focus on semiconductors, which will position us well in relation to China. And he passed some of the largest investments in clean energy. I mentioned the child tax credit. So he has a powerful record on which to run for re-election. Look, is it ideal that we have an 80-year-old running for president? No, but he's the best hope that we have for defeating Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. So I think he puts it well. Don't compare him to the almighty, compare him to the alternative.
Right. You talked about all the things he's gotten done. I confess to have been a longtime fan and supporter of Joe Biden's.
Yeah. And I've met with him in the White House on multiple occasions, and the notion that he lacks the mental capacity is total fiction.
So you guys say he's all there.
He's there. He's sharp. Yeah.
Okay. I no doubt that's clear from watching him.
He's no Nancy Pelosi, but no one's Nancy Pelosi. She is incredibly sharp.
What's interesting is the amount of things he's gotten done, and yet his approval ratings are as low as, he's 10th of the last 13 presidents rating towards the bottom of approval ratings. Is there some part of the party that just is not communicating well about the successes that it has?
Historically, I think we as Democrats are more effective at governing than branding, and the Republicans are more effective at branding than governing. It's an observation that Leader Jeffries often makes. But I believe that our country is so polarized that it imposes a ceiling on how popular a president can be. I often think of politics as religiosity without religion. That if you disagree with me, you're not merely wrong, but you're evil, and you should be burned at the stake for heresy. And every day, Fox News is driving home the message that Joe Biden is an existential threat to our country. And so naturally, that's going to drive down his approval ratings. The median, the perverse structure of our politics rewards extremism. If you're on the extremes, you'll generate more fundraising online, you'll get more publicity on cable news, you will have a much larger profile. And so I think that just deepens the polarization in our politics. And I think the same is true locally. I don't want to, I think I worry at times that the city's become ungovernable. I saw firsthand when I was in the council, the transformation of politics at the hands of social media. Bill de Blasio in particular was the first mayor to govern in the age of social media, and there were moments when it felt like the city was ungovernable because of social media.
Do a lot of your colleagues in Congress feel that way? That they're sort of either fearful?
I know my colleague Corey Johnson feels that way, yes. I think when the George Floyd protests were unfolding and there was momentum for defund the police, those budget negotiations were, I think, extraordinarily stressful for every member, but especially for Speaker Johnson at the time.
Is it in Congress, you talked about the polarization.
And thankfully, I'm happy to be insulated from that, so.
Got it.
Whenever I get a call about a shelter siting or a land use development, I call your councilman. Co-location, call your councilman.
Can you talk about polarization in Congress? So it seemed obviously there's some really famous, loud people in Congress, and you've been very vocal, particularly about Marjorie Taylor Greene. What's it like working with someone? First of all, do you work with someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene? And how much control does someone like that have over the breadth of the Republican congressional crowd?
Well, it will come as a shock to you, but there are reasonable Republicans, but the energy is on the far right. We saw early in the year there was a contrast between the unity of the Democratic Party around Leader Jeffries and the division and dysfunction and disunity of House Republicans over Kevin McCarthy, who was a hostage to the far right of his party. And we saw the longest speaker vote in more than 164 years, largely because of the extremes on the far right. The fact that we're even debating whether to breach the debt limit, whether to default on the obligations of the federal government, whether to compromise the full faith and credit of the United States, that's a function of the far right of the Republican Party. So I do believe there are reasonable Republicans, but those Republicans live in fear of the far right. And in my view, the greatest threat to our country comes not from the extremes, but from a center that lives in fear of the extremes. And the modern Republican Party is Exhibit A.
And by the way,
I was actually speaking to a foreign leader I asked him to describe his politics. He says, I'm like a moderate Republican. I said, we don't have those anymore, but that's,
Would you say the Republican Party feels that way about the Democratic Party as well? They look across the aisle and think,
I think both parties have their excesses, but again, I'm not aware of any left-wing activists who inspired an insurrection against the U.S. Capitol. I'm not aware of any left-wing activist who's advocating sabotaging the full faith and credit of the United States. So we certainly have excesses in our party, and I've never been shy about speaking out against those excesses, but I see no moral equivalence.
Can you talk more about the debt ceiling and kind of what you think the logical path here is at this point?
Well, look, the president has stood by, and McCarthy is effectively negotiating against himself in real time. But first, we reject the notion of negotiating around the debt limit. I think there are legitimate conversations to be had about putting the country on a sustainable fiscal trajectory, but it should be had in the context of the budget, not in the context of the debt limit. Because if we were to breach the debt limit, it would actually raise our borrowing cost, causing the United States to become more indebted, not less. It would produce the opposite of what Republicans claim to want. And it would be the height of fiscal irresponsibility. And I worry that the mere threat of a breach, separate and apart from the act itself, can do enormous damage. You might recall in 2011, the game of brinksmanship actually led, for the first time in American history, in a downgrade in the credit rating of the United States. So, we're playing with fire, and I feel like we can no longer take for granted the full faith and credit of the United States, the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and we should tread carefully. I have a number of colleagues, particularly on the Republican side, who worry about the strategic challenge from China. And I've said to them, our worst enemy is not China, Russia, North Korea, and ourselves. Our worst enemy is ourselves. If we were to breach the debt limit, we're going to do infinitely more damage to our economy than our enemies ever could. And so I think in the end, we're going to land the plane because McCarthy's going to have no choice but to make concessions. And I think so far you see he's negotiating against himself in real time, and he can't even unify his own party around a shared platform, a shared budget.
And do you reach an agreement ultimately because sort of some big piece of his constituency goes to him, his members go to him and say, come on? Or is that crowd, or is it more just a function of, I guess he seems like a complicated person. He's clearly the person who goes down to Mar-a-Lago and brings back Donald Trump, clearly takes that lead, and then seems to get...
But that's happening out of fear.
Right.
No one thinks that's an expression of genuine conviction.
But then he's rewarded for it, too. It might have been complicated how he got elected, but he's clearly rewarded for it. So I guess he seems to be rewarded for embracing things that, let's say, are not for the best of the nation or the best of the...
He's being rewarded for cynicism? Well, that's never happened in politics. That's...
Right. Speaking of rewarding cynicism, maybe it's a good time to talk about the Santos Act, also known as the Full Act.
Well, George Santos and I were both members of the Gay Latino Caucus in the New York delegation, so that's... Can
you talk about the reception for that legislation. Can you talk about your take on him and kind of do you think there's ultimately action taken?
Well, look, when I became a member of Congress, I never thought I would live through an insurrection. I never thought I would witness the longest speaker vote in 164 years. And I certainly never thought I would meet a fictional character like George Santos. I have trouble keeping track of his lies. He has pretended to be a gay, biracial, Ukrainian, Belgian, Brazilian, Jewish, Broadway producer and volleyball champion from Baruch College, whose mother died on 9/11, whose ancestors survived the Holocaust, whose employees died in the Pulse mass shooting. It's like the greatest fiction.
Rescues dogs.
And he's a dog rescuer in the history, and steals from the Amish in the history of congressional politics. What I find outrageous is that you can blatantly lie to the voters without facing legal repercussions. Like, there's a sense in which he fundamentally defrauded the voters. He was elected under false pretenses. And so I introduced the Santos Act, Stop Another Non-Truthful Office Seeker, which I think is the greatest acronym in the history of legislation. But it's a serious bill in the sense that it requires a candidate for public office, a federal candidate, to disclose in writing, under oath, under the penalty of perjury, their employment, military, and education history, so that candidates who do lie can finally face repercussions, right? As a voter, you should have the ability to compare what a candidate has said under oath versus what a candidate is claiming on the campaign trail. And the hope is that comparison will enable the early detection of liars like George Santos.
Can you talk about the reception of that from both sides of the aisle at this point?
I think there's been a favorable reception, but my honest assessment is that I think we're more likely to pass it in the next legislative session as a House rule. I think Republicans want to avoid bringing to the floor any bill that focuses on George Santos for obvious reasons. He's an albatross around the neck of the Republican Party, and he recently announced that he's running for re-election.
And he wants the AK-50, I'm going to get this right. He wants to have the national gun. That's the AK-15. I guess I'm going to show.
Yeah, he wore the pen. Right?
Show my New Yorkiness and not having a real clue as to that. But I guess Kai, is life with him? Is he truly a pariah there, or is it sort of like, well, he votes with us, so
he's persona non grata. I mean, almost every Republican in the New York delegation has called on him to resign. The overwhelming majority of his constituents have called on him to resign. I mean, he's so radioactive that even the cousin of a Russian oligarch, a sanctioned Russian oligarch, wants nothing to do with him. So,
when you started in Congress, you were in the majority, and now you find yourself in the minority.
It's better to be in the majority. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that transition, and how much harder is it to get done?
Look, when you're in the minority, you have no choice but to narrow your ambitions. They're just important pieces of legislation that are no longer within the realm of possibility. Like, I'm never going to persuade my Republican colleagues to embrace federal reinvestment in public housing. Your role is twofold. You have to play defense against the Republicans, but you also have to find areas of bipartisan cooperation and compromise. There's a sense in which there's a tale of two Congresses. Like, there's the performative Congress, and then there's the more substantive Congress. And if you want to be performative, if you want to go at it with Jim Jordan, you join the Judiciary Committee, there's a committee on the weaponization of government, there's the committee on the coronavirus origins. Like, those are the performative committees. But if you want to do real policy with serious Democrats and Republicans, then you join committees like Financial Services. So I have a good working relationship with the Republican chair, Patrick McHenry. We've co-sponsored bills together. And then I'm on the new Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and China. And I have a constructive working relationship with Mike Gallagher, actually. So it depends on, so I tend to focus more on the policy rather than the performative politics of going at it with Jim Jordan.
You've mentioned China a few times. Obviously there was just that arrest of those Chinese nationals for running a police station, so to speak, and arresting people.
That actually came out of my rally. So Mike Gallagher and I actually held a rally in New York City. According to human rights organization Safeguard Defenders, the Chinese Communist Party has a transnational network of more than 100 secret police stations in 50 countries, including the United States, and in cities, including in New York. And the purpose of these police stations is not to solve crime, but it's to terrorize Chinese nationals who have spoken out against the human rights violations of the Chinese Communist Party. And we persuaded the FBI to finally crack down on one of these police stations.
Do you think, on a foreign policy basis, like, are we at war with China, or is war inevitable, in your opinion?
There's nothing that keeps me up at night more than the potential for war with China. I feel like the situation is more dangerous than people realize, and it's the most dangerous it's been since World War II. A war with China would be catastrophic, but there are certainly signs that the risk is rising. So China is threatening to invade Taiwan. Xi Jinping, who is the most powerful leader that China has had since Mao Zedong, has directed his military to be prepared to take Taiwan by force by 2027. And so in response, the United States has been bolstering its force posture in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll just cite a few examples. Taiwan has expanded military conscription. So mandatory military service has gone from 4 months to 1 year. Japan is undertaking the largest military buildup in its history. It's doubling defense spending from 1% to 2% of GDP. The United States just entered into a new security alliance with Australia and UK, in which we're going to equip Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, which are not nuclear weapons, but these are powerful submarines. And we have expanded military coordination with the Philippines. And so all of this is deterrence, and deterrence is a paradox. Deterrence is about preparing for war for the purpose of preventing war. But both sides are moving toward a wartime posture. And I cannot, that would be catastrophic. First, it would shut down the semiconductor manufacturing. So Taiwan, even though it's a country of only 23 million people, Taiwan produces more than 90% of the advanced semiconductors in the world. 90%. It's the most concentrated supply chain in the world. So all of our smartphones are dependent on semiconductors that are produced in Taiwan. And if we went to war with China, it would crush the semiconductor market. It would crush whole sectors of the economy that depend on semiconductors, whether it's artificial intelligence. I mean, almost everything, every technology have some kind of semiconductors. And then China could do real harm to us. China controls the rare earth elements that go into so many of the products that we use. It controls 60% of the mining, 80% of the refinery. One of our largest corporations in America is Apple. There's a sense in which Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, has more influence over Apple than the president, because 20% of their sales are in China. Most of their production is in China. He could wake up tomorrow morning and decide, I'm going to put out of business one of the largest corporations in the United States. So that just gives you a glimpse, and not to mention tens of thousands of lives lost. The world would be significantly poorer as a result of a war between the United States and China. And unlike previous wars where the United States was clearly the superior power, China is a comparable military power at this point. China has the ability to disrupt our communications and our radars and our command and control networks. And in the age of cyber warfare, what happens in the Indo-Pacific won't stay in the Indo-Pacific, right? China has the capacity to launch attacks on our critical infrastructure, our water, our energy systems, our financial services. I would argue the most vulnerable sector of our critical infrastructure is our water, not so much in New York, but elsewhere. Our water is decentralized. There are 52,000 water systems, and most of those systems are operated by local governments that lack the resources to defend their water systems from a sophisticated nation state like China. So this is what keeps me up at night.
And is there an appreciation across the breadth?
Sorry for that bloviation, but that
No, but
it's a complicated issue, yeah.
we understand the seriousness. It's also fascinating to see, honestly, somebody who we associate with so much of our own local political life to talk about the global issues that you're facing, our nation's facing. Does our government, breadth of our government, appreciate how serious this is? Whether it's the
Biden administration appreciates it, absolutely. And he's actually, back in October, we put in place, so of all the technologies, and there's a new book that I would recommend, CHIPS, but it rightly identifies semiconductors as the most critical of critical technologies. Whoever wins the semiconductor race is well positioned to win the AI race, the quantum computing race, the synthetic biology race. And the Biden administration put in place export controls that prevent the transfer of the most advanced semiconductors to China. And that was a smart move by the Biden administration.
You're named after Ritchie Valens?
Yes.
Is that true?
Yeah, so my mother was watching the movie La Bamba in 1986 or 1987, I forget when. It's a great movie. And she just felt inspired to name me after Ritchie Valens, which is why I'm Ritchie with a T, not Ritchie Rich, Ritchie Poor. And she named my brother after the Reuben sandwich, from which I infer that I'm the favorite son, because it's better to be named after a singer than a sandwich.
And your sister?
My sister's Melissa. Yeah. I mean, the sisters
All
are
brothers?
The sisters are always the favorite. I'm a twin.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I'm biologically younger, but temperamentally older than my brother. So.
Congressman.
And I just want to thank Jano because when the MTA came out with the environmental assessment on congestion pricing, showing that there would be significant diesel truck traffic diversion from the central business district to the Bronx, even though I support congestion pricing in principle, I spoke out forcefully. I said, I'm not going to allow the Bronx to become a dumping ground for the diesel truck traffic of Manhattan. And to the credit of the governor and to Jano's credit, he proactively reached out, and we have been engaged in months and months of conversations about the best strategies for mitigating the environmental impacts on the South Bronx. So I appreciate your commitment to ensuring that we have a viable transit system, but also aligning congestion pricing with environmental justice. So thank you for your public service. And when people ask me, is congestion pricing going to get done? I said yes, because Jano Lieber is the chair of the MTA, and he means business, and he is as sharp an operator as any you will find in state government. So.
Thank you all for coming.
So that was a Jano Lieber infomercial?
Yeah. It's our pleasure. Please
Thank you.
come to us. We want to work with you.
Absolutely.
And please come back.
Thank you so much. Thank you.